All right, so we're back. We're doing another interview, and joining me today is Ron Marz. Ron, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
No problem, Drew. Good to see you again.
Yeah. Um, Real quick, one of the first things I want to ask, and I always start every interview with this, is your story, just how you broke into the industry. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's the story I always tell. Jim Starlin said, "Do you want to write comics?" And I said, "Okay," and I got to write comics. That's the short version. I was friends with Jim, and so we moved in the same social circles. I played, went to the movies with those guys. Um, him and Bernie Wrightson, Terry Austin. I was just sort of in the same area as those guys, and they brought me into the group, even though I was obviously, a fair bit younger than most of those guys. And Jim, I was working at the local newspaper while I was still in college. Jim knew I was a writer and had me copy edit his prose novel, his first prose novel. And he liked what I did well enough there that he said, "Hey, did you ever think about writing comics?" And, obviously you think about writing comics, but you don't think you're actually going to get a chance to do it. But Jim took me by the hand and showed me how to, showed me what the script looked like and, kind of gave me the 20 minutes, here's how we think about comics. And I found that I could do that. Like my mind would break a story down into panels, into visuals. Um, and I co-wrote a few jobs with Jim, and then I started getting work on my own, and I've literally been doing it ever since.
So, what was like after that? What was the first comic that you wrote? Was it DC or was it Marvel?
Marvel, it was a Silver Surfer.
Okay, I thought so. Yep.
Jim was on Silver Surfer at the time, so I did Silver Surfer Annual was the first thing I actually wrote, but it was not the first thing that came out. I think some regular Surfer issues that I co-wrote with Jim came out first, but I had written those slightly afterwards. And then the first solo thing I did was like a 20-page backup in a Surfer Annual that a guy named Jim Sherman was supposed to write and draw. Old friend of Starlin's, drew Legion of Superheroes in the 70s and did a bunch of work in the 80s too. And Sherman disappeared in the Yucatan Peninsula uh, for months at a time and never reappeared to do his surfer backup. So they asked me if I wanted to write it and have Ron Lim draw it. And of course, you say yes. And that was the first solo thing that I did, and it was received well enough that they just kept giving me work.
So, what were some of the characters you grew up liking? What were your favorite characters?
As a kid, I was a big Avengers reader.
Oh,
That
really?
was that was my book. Yeah, the sort of George Perez, John Byrne Avengers, and really, John Byrne, Chris Claremont, and Terry Austin on X-Men were the books I read as a kid. Um, and then, you hit 13 or 14 and decide you're too old for comics. But I kept reading Savage Sword of Conan because that, had naked chicks in it. That seemed, because that was magazine size. That was comics were for kids, but magazines, well, that was for adults. So I read that and Epic Illustrated, which was sort of Marvel's version of heavy metal at the time that lasted for I don't know 4 or 5 years, something like that. And so I read that and sort of discovered comics again in the mid '80s um, when I was in high school. Simonson's Thor and Miller's Daredevil, Wolfman and Perez on Teen Titans. So those were the books that sort of brought me back into reading comics. And then, right about then, Dark Knight came out and Watchmen came out, and sort of comics comics grew up.
Yeah.
Or at least that's what the headlines in every newspaper that ran a comic book story said. Um, and then a few years later, I was hanging out with Starlin and Wrightson, and literally while I was still in college. So, and shortly thereafter, I started writing.
Awesome. Shifting the focus to Green Lantern, I love Kyle Rayner, love the work you did on Green Lantern. Um, can you talk a little bit about that, like taking over that project? How did it come about? A little
Um,
behind the scenes.
I got a call fairly late in the evening, I think on a Thursday. Um, I had been down at Marvel all day fighting with my Thor editor, for what we were gonna end up doing, and that answer eventually became I left the book because I was not real happy with the situation. But I got a call, sort of later in the evening from DC that said, "Hey, do you want to take over Green Lantern?" And the call had like the main guys at DC were on the call. It was in addition to the Green Lantern editor, Kevin Dooley, who I had done some short stories for. Um, it was Denny O'Neil, Archie Goodwin, Mike Carlin, who were sort of the triumvirate of editors who really ran things at DC, and the publisher Paul Levitz. So when you get that call in the evening and those people are on the line, either something good is going to happen or something really bad is going to happen. Um, and it turned out to be good. It turned out to be, we would like you to take this book because they had been reading my surfer stuff, and there's always satisfaction in poaching somebody from the other publisher. Um, and then they said, here's what we want you to do. And they sort of gave me a very abbreviated version of what Emerald Twilight was going to be. That basically Hal was going to be moved off stage, and I would get to create a new Green Lantern. So, um,
How could
you
you
know,
pass that up?
yeah. Well, well, obviously I couldn't, but it took me about a week to think about it because I knew that it was going to be, I knew that it was going to be controversial, at the very least, and it was going to attract a lot of attention. That's a blade that cuts both ways. And I also had a bunch of work lined up in Marvel, so I had to figure out how I was going to balance all this stuff. But after, a week or so of thinking about it, I said, yeah, okay, let's do this. And then I had to hit the ground running because it was late. They had already solicited at least a couple of issues of the previous team's intentions for issues 48, 49, and maybe even 50.
Really?
Um, so we had to, those books got resolicited with the new creative team on it, new storyline. So I ended up writing all three of those issues, which 48, 49, and 50, kind of at the same time because everything was so late and we needed to get the books done so that they could come out relatively on time. So I ended up writing, a chunk of pages for 48, a chunk of pages for 49, and a chunk of pages for 50 to get all of the artists involved working, because we needed three different artists because it was so late. So I wrote pages for Bill Willingham and Fred Haynes and Darryl Banks, who was going to be the regular penciler and continue on the book with me just to get everybody working at the same time and then go back and finish off the rest of the issues. So it was kind of a mad scramble. I mean, I wrote all of that stuff in a very short span. And frankly, wherever wherever I could squeeze time in, I wrote some of it between sets at a Peter Gabriel concert. I wrote some of it on the train going into New York City. I didn't do much of anything for a couple of weeks except get those three issues completed.
Wow. I never knew that it was like an editorial thing that they were like, this is what we want to do.
Yeah, I mean, you don't really you as the freelancer don't get a chance to come in and say, hey, you know what, we're going to get rid of Hal Jordan. Um,
Right.
that's,
Makes sense.
those decisions are made by the owners, uh, not by the help. Um, so they editorially had decided this is the way this is going to go. This is the way we want to, the book wasn't selling. Um, they viewed the franchise as, sort of moribund and not really attracting the kind of attention they wanted it to. So they wanted to do something that was going to attract a lot of attention, which followed on the heels of the death of Superman and Bane breaking Batman's back, which were obviously both huge culturally in terms of attracting attention, but also just huge sales wise. So this was the next one in the series. And but the obviously the difference was that this was permanent. Superman got better, Batman got better, and
Right.
Hal was out of the book for like 10 years,
Yeah.
at least in terms of being Green Lantern. So there was never a back door for as far as I was concerned, as far as anybody ever told me that we didn't build a back door into the story because there was no going back. It was we were landing on exotic alien shores and we were burning the boats behind us.
Right. Now, can you talk a little bit about like the creative process behind like, with Daryl Banks? I have actually had Daryl Banks on the podcast before. Great artist, great guy. Uh, just talk a little about Kyle. Like where'd you get the name from? Just who he is?
Um, the first, I mean, where'd we get Kyle? We made him up. I mean,
Yeah.
that's really the truth of it is we just made him up. DC editorial allowed us to just make up a character. I don't think you would get that sort of latitude these days because
Right.
it's much more there's much more corporate control and there's much more riding on it in terms of media dollars. These are not just when we did it, it was just comic books. Now these
Right.
are all multimedia platforms. And you know, I felt like if we were going to do if we were going to do a storyline that removed Hal Jordan from being Green Lantern, there was no sense in doing a Hal Jordan type of character to take over.
Right.
I wanted to do something as different from Hal, and I felt like Hal was very much a hero before he even gets the power ring, right?
Yeah.
He's a fearless test pilot. He's Chuck Yeager. He's right out of the right stuff, which I think certainly in the 60s was perfect. Was a great take on a character, and I think it even works now. But if the decision was that okay, we're not going to have that guy as the lead anymore, I wanted to go in a different direction, and for me, I was always attracted more to, as a reader, I was always more attracted to characters that were just regular guys. The
Yeah.
sort of the Peter Parker archetype, where it's just your character is the everyman and he is in over his head and he has to figure out a way to, make this work. Um, and it's not natural to him. Like being a hero is, I think, natural to Hal Jordan.
Right.
Uh, I wanted to do somebody who had to grow into the role and who had to sort of, who had to learn to do this job. He wasn't cut out for it initially. Again, much like the Spider-Man archetype, where it's just you can see yourself in that character. Um, so the first name came from Kyle Reese from the Terminator movies, who was the character
Okay.
I
Yeah.
always liked, and I just liked the name. And then um, Rayner came from a list of Irish surnames that the editor sent, probably 50 or 60 names long, uh, that he plucked off the internet somewhere. Uh, or maybe I don't know, maybe we weren't even looking at the internet then. But it was a list of Irish surnames, and I picked Rayner out of it just because I liked the way it sounded together.
Yeah. No, it's great. Great name.
Um, so and actually little did I know that there's an actual person named Oswald Rayner who was like the um one of the models for James Bond. He was a like World War One and post World War One spy.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah. Yeah, I had no idea at the time. I found it
Wow.
out much later when we included his character in another book that I wrote.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean it's not an uncommon name in the UK, and I just liked the way it sounded, and for the most part, DC just let us run with it. I remember asking if we could do if it had to be an Earth character to be the new star of Green Lantern, and they said, yeah, we want it to be based on Earth, and I said, can it be a woman, or do you want to stick with a male lead? And they wanted a male lead. That was the only direction they gave us. So
Wow.
male human was the only direction they gave us, and we just made up Kyle from whole cloth, really. And he is pretty much, as you see him now, he's that's pretty much what we came up with. That, okay, we don't have a Green Lantern with black hair. Let's give him black hair. Uh,
Yeah.
let's give him green eyes, although they don't always get colored that way, because that's sort of obvious that we should do that. Um, and and the costume was just Daryl came up with a bunch of different costume looks, because the decision was, okay, well, let's give him a unique costume since he's the last one. Give him a unique costume. Don't have him in Hal's costume. And Daryl came up with a number of different costume variations, and um, we sort of we sort of did a conglomeration of a few uh, so we took the mask from this one and the gauntlets from this one, and put it all together, and then he refined it into the look that he debuted with, and which is pretty much his look now.
And I always love how like no matter what costume he has over the years, it always goes back to that. It's just like it seems like every creative that's done Green Lantern is just like let's give it back, get that costume.
Well, I think, to a great extent, that's the costume that you debut in is most often the one that you end up with long
Right.
term, because it's, the audience kind of expects it, and the audience that's there for that wants their nostalgia hit. And very often it's, the costumes that come afterwards are just not as good as the original. I think for the most part, that's true with most all the characters, that somebody gets an updated costume and eventually that goes away because it's just not quite what the audience is looking for.
Right. Now, why a graphic designer? I'm a graphic designer, so I always kind of connected with Kyle for that reason. I was like, oh, awesome. I identified that. I was, first time I had read it, was I was in high school and I was just like, always kind of wanted to learn more about Kyle. And then it was around the time I decided my career path and it was like, oh, perfect, graphic designer.
Well, it was really, um, it's a special effects book, right? That's one of the main reasons you show up to the book, is because you want to see what kind of cool stuff the ring makes. And so I wanted to have a character that naturally was going to have an imagination to make cool stuff with the ring. So I thought, well, that means an artist. Plus, I love art. I love artists. I can't draw to save my life, but most of my best friends in the world are artists, and if I have a free afternoon, I'm going to an art museum. I just, I like the mentality and the creative fire that, you have to pursue that. So, I just felt like, well, that makes sense. I can work with that. And a lot of it is about, what sort of character I wanted to write and Darryl wanted to draw, and what made sense. But also in a, like I said, in a big way, it was an excuse to make sure that we were doing cool stuff with the ring, not just boxing gloves and big guns.
Right. Kind of different than the simplicity. I always kind of thought of like Hal Jordan. All the constructs are very simple, but you think like it makes sense with the ability like that. The powers. You get the most creative guy possible with that. It's like what could it come up with?
Sure, and part of it is, part of it, the reality of it is that printing technology kept getting better, and we could show off cooler stuff in the book because the printing was going to be better, and we had the ability to do that. Whereas, Gil Kane in the '60s is, cranking out a lot of pages per day. And okay, boxing glove, catcher's mitt, that kind of stuff works. Um, and the printing of that era was appropriate for that stuff. So um, we set ourselves a rule that Kyle could not make the same ring creation twice.
Okay.
He could do, he could make a shield, multiple times or a suit of armor or whatever, but it could never look the same. It couldn't be the same shield. It had to be something different, which, after 7 years on the book, it turned into a real pain in our ass. But we tried to stick to that as much as possible. Is that okay? Well, it's got to be something. It's got to be something different every time because that's part of the reason that the audience is showing up is to for us to show you some cool things.
So I know, you had this long run with Kyle, and then, eventually Jeff Johns takes over Green Lantern, but keeps Kyle around. But then you do Ion. What was that like? What was that experience? Did you
Um,
talk with Jeff a lot on that?
yeah, I mean Jeff and I are friends, and I think I was one of the first people Jeff talked to up at DC because I happened to be up at the office a couple of times when he was up there when he was still Richard Donner's assistant and was just breaking in. And I feel like you have a responsibility you know, to welcome the next generation, just like I was welcomed by Starlin and Wrightson. You try to pay forward what the kindnesses that were done for you. So I tried to do that anytime I saw Jeff, and we just got to be friends. You know, it was. Um, Jeff and I remember Jeff and I had a conversation up in the halls at DC. So back when DC was in Manhattan, that, you know, when Jeff was taking over Green Lantern, and he said, Kyle's not going anywhere. I want to keep him around, and I want to, make sure that make sure that he gets his due because you and Kyle kept the book alive for 10 years um, and sort of saved the franchise in a lot of ways when interest was flagging. So he wanted to make sure that Kyle stuck around and was part of, no pun intended, was part of the Green Lantern rebirth. Because obviously when we took over the book, it shrunk to one hero. It shrunk. It was not the big cosmic space opera. And 10 years later the world was ready for big cosmic space opera again. So, so the book could grow. The cast could grow, the whole spectrum of the book could grow. Um, and look, that's the nature of comics. The nature of comics, at the very least, is the illusion of change. Um, I learned that from Mike Carlin, who was the Superman editor and really the editor in chief at DC during the 90s. And we happened to be sitting in his office one day, and he said, comics are really about the illusion of change, and sometimes the change gets people excited, sometimes it gets them pissed off, but it always keeps people interested. And you eventually go back to, you go back to square one, you go back to where you started, but that illusion of change is what generates reader interest. It's what keeps people coming back to the book because they want to see, what happens.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. Absolutely. I mean, even all the big swings you see even now, like it's either gonna, get people excited or pissed off. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Well, look, I think a lot of people forget that publishing is a business, publishing comics is a business. And it's certainly for those of us on the creative side, it's first and foremost, a creative pursuit and our jobs, it's our livelihood. But the publisher ultimately has to sell enough copies to keep the doors open. So the publisher, both in a corporate sense and in a personal sense, the person that's sitting in that chair, um, has to be making business decisions as well as creative decisions because the job is to sell enough comics to turn a profit, to keep the doors open.
Um, I've talked to so many writers about this, and they normally give me a similar answer. But what is it like when you write a character, or in this case, create a character, and then you hand it off to someone else. Does it feel like you're kind of seeing someone with like an ex-girlfriend? Is that how it
Yeah,
feels
I
for
mean,
you or
you're sending your kid off to live with somebody else.
right.
You're putting your kid out for adoption.
Yeah.
Um, However, that's the bargain you make when you get in. Like, even though, um, even though Daryl and I created Kyle, um, and he is what he is because of us, um, I think we were both adult enough to understand that he didn't belong to us. Um, you sign that work for hire contract, ultimately that the publisher is going to do with that character whatever they want to do. It's not yours. And if you're not comfortable with that arrangement, if you're not comfortable with at some point putting that character back on the shelf and walking away for somebody else to come play, um, don't do it. Like don't don't create a character that the publisher is going to own and then be pissed off because they're doing stuff that you didn't agree with. I mean, that's the bargain you made when you signed the contract, when you took the check. Um, and sometimes it's not great. I don't mean specifically in the in for Kyle, because I've been generally pretty happy with the fact that he's still around, and people seem to treat the character very kindly. Um, but look, sometimes things go sideways and you don't really like what they're doing. But the nature of comics has changed, at least the illusion of change. So if you don't like what's going on right now, come back in a year and it'll probably be different.
Right. Right. Um, what would you say is like it doesn't have to be Green Lantern. It could be, any book you've written over the years. What would you say is like your favorite storyline that you've written?
Um,
Something that you keep kind of going back to, like, oh, I got to beat that, or
I don't know that I'm the one that should answer that question, because it's really, you end up again having to pick your favorite out of all your children.
right,
Um, and I do think there's a difference between um, work for hire stuff, Green Lantern, Surfer, Marvel versus DC, Star Wars, any of that stuff that I've done. You are playing with someone else's toys in their playground,
right,
which is great. It's the best job in the world, but it's also a very different experience ultimately than doing creator-owned stuff, um, which is yours. You own it. It's exactly what you want it to be, because there's no one to tell you no. There's no one to tell you what to do with it, because nobody else is allowed to tell you what to do with it. Um, work for hire wise, it's really hard for me to pick out one thing, because I've had
yeah,
such a good time with virtually everything I've ever worked on. Um, that there are very few gigs that I look back on for Marvel or DC or Dark Horse or whoever that I didn't like. Um, uh, Creator own wise, those are all things that are sort of near and dear to you. Um, I think probably at the top of that list is a book I did at Dark Horse called Samurai Heaven and Earth, which is out of print now, and is actually, the full rights have returned to me and to Luke Ross, who is the artist on the book, and eventually we'll do more with it. But
awesome.
that historical samurai adventure, and that was just like every page of that thing. We did 10 issues total, and every page of it is just exactly what I want it to be. It's the most of the stuff you work on, if you're working with good people, is satisfying, but creator own stuff that you do is more satisfying than any of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like nowadays, like the way the industry is, like it's almost like a lot of writers almost break into the industry like the opposite way. When before it was like you had to be at the big two. Now I've been seeing more people start with the creator own and work their way into that stuff, or sometimes just stay
Oh
in the
yeah,
comic
it's
book space.
it's it's very much, yeah, it's sort of the mirror opposite of the way that I broke in, which was you made your bones at the big two and got enough name recognition to go off and do some creator own work. And there were obviously much fewer venues to do creator own work in those days. Now there are a lot of venues to do creator-owned work, especially since Hollywood discovered comics and decided that adapting comics to other media was a viable vehicle. Now you can do creator-owned stuff everywhere, or just kickstart it and do it yourself. So virtually everybody that breaks into comics now starts with creator-owned because there's no one to tell you no. You can just sit down and do your book. And the creator-owned stuff is what gets you noticed by Marvel and DC, and you sort of eventually, I mean, in some ways, you stop doing creator-owned stuff and you go work on somebody else's characters.
Right.
Because usually, there's a better paycheck involved in that, or there's a paycheck involved in that. A lot of times, creator-owned work doesn't have a lot of compensation involved until after the book goes on sale. Um, but yeah, I mean, for someone like me who broke in at Marvel, like the first script I ever wrote was published by Marvel Comics, which is nuts. That sort of thing doesn't happen. Now to see, there are writers and artists who toil for 10 years doing indie work, creator-owned work, and eventually get a chance in a Marvel or DC book. I I don't know that I would have had the fortitude to stick it out that long if that had been the path that existed when I was breaking in. Because that's an awful lot of work and an awful lot of, knocking on doors and setting up at conventions and there's an awful lot of work that goes into breaking in at Marvel and DC just to get the chance to do a book. And frankly, a lot of creators who eventually get a chance at a Marvel DC book last for 2, 3, 4 years, and then they're gone because that's a renewable resource, and there's always people that are willing to come in and do that work.
Right. The only reason I ask is I'm an aspiring writer myself. I've worked on a couple small projects doing different roles, editing, writing, coloring, lettering. I was just curious if you had any advice for, someone wanting to break into the industry.
Well, my advice, the first thing I would advise is to stop saying aspiring.
Right.
If you're a writer, if you write, you're a writer, right? There's, like maybe you're not getting paid for it, so that's a difference, but you're still doing the work. I mean, I tell people that, if I do a workshop on comics or people that I see at conventions or whatever, like don't say aspiring. That's selling yourself short. Just say I'm a writer. Because if you write, you're a writer. And most people do not write. Most people talk about writing. Most people fool around in a notebook. They don't actually write anything. Um,
Right.
so actually sitting down to do the work, you know, you have lapped the field already. Um, and really, my advice to somebody who wants to make comics is to make comics. Um, the best way to learn how to make comics is to make comics. Um,
Absolutely.
and there's alchemy to how this is done. It's a writer and an artist and a colorist and a letterer, maybe an editor, and like everybody has to do their job in that creative chain um, to make the book come out. Um, and if just one link in that chain doesn't do the job, the whole thing falls apart. Uh, so there's a lot of fortitude that's necessary um, to actually make a comic, to even do like an 8-page story and get it into an anthology, or do an 8-page story and publish it online. Um, like the vast, vast majority of people never get to that point of doing it. Um, so my advice is, look, if you want to make comics, make comics. There are resources out there. Certainly, there are resources out there that didn't exist when I was breaking in for how you do this and how you connect with other creators. And it's it's a lot of hard work. I think I when I teach, I tell the students, like, this is the hardest type of writing you can do, and it's certainly the hardest type of art you can do. Um, Writers and artists of comics are the special forces of creatives because we have to be adept at um, so many different skills. Um, Not only telling the story and writing convincing dialogue and creating convincing characters, but understanding visually how that story is going to get told and conveying that to the artist. And then it's the artist's job to bring that to life. And it's a huge range of skills that go into it. And the only way to get good at it is to do it. The only way to, you don't step in against major league pitching the first time you grab a bat. You you take batting practice and you hit against pitching machines and you hit against lesser competition, and eventually you get to the point where you can step in against a guy throwing 98. Um, so you know, make a comic. And the first comic you make is going to suck because you don't know what you're doing. And but the point is, the first comic's going to suck. The second comic, you're going to take the lessons that you learned in the first one and apply them in the second one. The second one's going to suck less. And then the third one's going to suck less than that. So, the best way to do this is to do it. Uh, you 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 can teach yourself how to be good at comics by making comics. And well, I think a lot of times the creatives that are involved in that sort of project don't realize that they're getting better because you're too close. You can't see the forest for the trees. You're too close to the product. But just sitting down and doing it and finishing it. Don't, oh, we're going to do a 100-page graphic novel. Like, do an 8-page story that's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and finish it and get the satisfaction and the lessons from finishing it, and then move on to the next one. Um, Again, there's nobody to tell you no. You can do a Kickstarter to recoup the cost of printing, or maybe even pay yourselves a little bit of money. The way that the industry has evolved in terms of crowdfunding makes all things possible. Uh, like there's you don't need permission from anyone, and now if you put the work in on a crowdfunded project, you don't need anybody's money to do this either. It's a lot of work. Crowdfunding is a lot of work. Uh, Making even an 8 or 10 page comic is a lot of work. But if you don't want to work for it, I guess you don't want it real bad.
Right. I'm actually working on a comic right now with my brother, actually. Like just a 15-page comic. I wrote the story, he's drawing it, I'm coloring it.
That's,
So,
you know, that's I think that's the way. Look, the way we started this conversation, which was how did you break in? Like, that's nobody's story except mine. Like, Jim Starlin said, "Do you want to write comics?" I mean, that's insane. That's crazy. And the fact that I got to do it and I'm still doing it is even more insane. Much more common is the sense of I'm going to sit down and do this, and we're going to learn how this works by by making a comic. Um, the best feeling in the world is when that first comic is done. And if you go to press with it, if you actually get it printed, and even getting it printed is easy because there are so many print on demand places where um, you can get your book printed, and the box shows up at your house and you open the box and there's your book and you get to hold that thing. Um, that's the coolest feeling in the world. And look, I'll admit that I'm somewhat jaded to that point now because I've written, I don't know, 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 comics. I have no idea how many. Um, but still the sense, like, you wrote your story and your brother's going to draw it. The coolest thing ever, and it was true 30 years ago and it's true now, is when you write the script and then you get that artwork back and see what the pages turned out like. The thing that just existed in your head is now made real in front of you. That's still the that's still the most priceless thing that goes on in this whole affair, is that the nugget of the germ of an idea that you had in your head somehow got made into a real thing. Um, that's the most satisfying part of the experience, and it's the one that they could never pay you enough money to replace.
Wow, well said. Honestly, Ron, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I love all the insight to Green Lantern, to Kyle, and even just comics. This was great. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Drew. My pleasure. Go work on that comic. You got to get that
Yeah.
thing done.